mainly because it came too late in the Spectrum's lifespan. It was released in 1987, at which time more powerful 16-bit computers like the Amiga and Atari were already available, wowing the public with their superior graphics, sound and storage options. It was also not a real Sinclair computer, Sir Clive having sold off his prodigy to Alan Sugar's Amstrad the previous year. So this machine was the best bits of the Amstrad CPC range, the keyboard, connectivity and built-in storage, plus the best bits of the Spectrum, massive games catalogue, easy to use and a thriving copying community. The Plus 3 was the last of the Spectrums, and in many people's eyes it was the best, but it still had its faults though. The machine itself was larger than previous machines, nearly twice as big as the rubber-keyed version and a third larger than the Spectrum Plus. It was heavier too, that was because of the built-in floppy drive. The 3-inch drive was the same as the one used in the Amstrad CPC range, capable of holding around 350k per disc across two sides. The drive only had one read-write head though, so the disc had to be turned over to read the contents of the other side of the disc. Speed-wise it was a huge step up from tapes, loading a typical 48k game in around 3 to 5 seconds, depending on how it was stored on the disc and whether it included things like a loading screen. New commands were added to the ROM to allow for cataloguing, formatting, reading, writing, erasing and moving files to and from the disc. But because there was only one drive, you could use the RAM drive as temporary storage. The case is a sturdy piece of plastic. Under the Spectrum range, the Plus 3s are thought of as the most robust. The keyboard, again taken from the CPC range, is another big step up from the Plus machine, offering real keys and a nice solid feel, and a lovely sound as well. There are single keys for certain characters like quotes or delete, and the familiar keywords of the 48k days are no longer to be found, apart from the odd, well-used command like load. If you switch to 48k mode though, they're still there, but 128k basic offers a much better typing experience, and you don't have to look for the commands on the keys, just type them in fully. Connectivity-wise, there are two joystick ports for Sinclair joysticks on the left-hand side, next to the reset button. At the back there's the normal ZX expansion port, featuring some annoying changes that means that some peripherals no longer work. There's also an expansion for an external disk drive, alongside a Centronics parallel printer interface. At last there's a video out socket that allows the use of SCART cables, a big improvement over RF, which is still available if required. There's an audio socket too to load and save to tape, so you can still load all your old games. There's also an RS-232 serial port that can double up as a MIDI port, and an auxiliary port. Usage-wise, we get the familiar 128k start screen, offering a variety of choices. If there's a disc in the drive, it will try and load that, if not it will wait for a tape signal. Once in BASIC, there's another menu that allows full screen editing, renumbering, printing or exiting back to the main menu. On the downside, every Plus 3 had a built-in sound fault. Sound via the television was distorted due to an error on the PCB. There are various ways to fix this issue, and they can be found on the internet. Sadly though, I've not been brave enough to attempt it yet. The other common fault was the drive belt. This often decays, leaving the drive inoperable. Luckily you can get replacement belts quite easily, and quite cheaply. Software-wise, there were titles commercially available on disc, some exclusively so, like those from Magnetic Scrolls. Companies released compilations of their older 48k titles too, and often sold two versions of their newer games, one on tape and one on disc. Loading and saving to disc was nowhere near as complex as using a ZX microdrive. There were no strange commands to remember. Loading and saving used the same commands as tape, but because the A drive was the default storage system, the Plus 3 used that. Simple. My Plus 3 has been permanently set up right beside my PC since it arrived, and I've spent many a good hour converting my old games across and saving them to disc and building little boot menus. It's everything I ever wanted out of a Spectrum in the 80s, and although it isn't a Sinclair machine, it still has that special something. P47 Thunderbolt was released quite late in the Spectrum's life, 1990 to be exact, and it is, if you didn't know, a version of the arcade game P47 Phantom Fighter. The arcade game was a multicoloured wonder of horizontal shoot-'em-up action, with everything you came to expect, like power-ups and boss battles. The Spectrum version, for me, seemed fairly flat in comparison, with hardly any sound, even on a 128K machine, and the little sound there was consisted of the same beep no matter what you did. This was 1990, what were they really thinking? The game has various levels, which are handled via a multi-load system, each with its own distinct graphics, but usually the same type of enemy. There tends to be specific level enemies that show up halfway through, like horizontal missiles on the first level for example, or larger diagonal missiles on level 2. The landscape is monochrome and scrolls smoothly enough, but level 2 just made my eyes bleed. Yes, it's parallax, but really? Are you saying the colours couldn't have been used better? The gameplay starts off okay, but soon becomes monotonous. The power-ups don't help, giving you little in the way to survive. I found myself prodding the fire key continually and not actually getting into the game at all. Because I had recently lost a life, the end of level boss on level 1 took ages to kill, and once you'd found the sweet spot, it was just a matter of sitting there prodding the fire key. The Spectrum was never going to match the lush colours of the arcade machine though, but I think they could have made a better effort than what was released. Some things doesn't seem right as well. It's as though the game was never completed, especially when you consider the control panel graphics. They look slightly corrupt. As it is then, I think this game is average at best, and I usually like shoot-'em-ups, but to me this seems like lazy programming. Paratroopers was released by Rabbit Software in 1983 and was written by John Kane. John later went on to bring us some classics like Booty and Marble Madness, but this is from a much earlier time. I found this game in a batch of old games recently given to me by a friend. The cassette inlay looks cheap and the game itself is 16K. Well, actually it's just short of 7K and strangely has 2 loading screens. According to the inlay, life gets lonely sitting in your bunker with only a greasy ack-ack gun to converse with while waiting for the enemy to drop in, and your task, when they do arrive, is to shoot them and stop them landing. The player controls a nicely animated gun at the bottom of the screen, which can fire at various angles to destroy the enemy choppers. Paratroopers are released randomly, and your aim is to stop them, either by shooting their parachutes so that they fall to the ground and explode, or shooting them instead, in which case they explode. If 5 of them do manage to land, then the game is over, and something very nasty happens, but more about that later. One thing you have to remember also is that each shot you take will reduce your overall score, so you have to be careful, and that adds an extra layer onto the game. It's a very simplistic game, despite the varying things you have to remember, and my initial play didn't last very long, or enthuse me in any way at all. I was however reviewing it, so I played it again and again and again, and my score gradually increased. It's a kind of game that can draw you in, and it's a pity you've only got one life. Yes, it has simple graphics, yes, it's got simple sound, and yes, it does slow down when there are lots of things happening on screen, but after a few plays it begins to grow on you, and without noticing you start another game straight away. Not that you get any choice in the matter, as soon as you die, the next game begins. Now back to the end of game moment. I have no idea why, but once 5 paratroopers have landed, the game ends and a huge tank appears, trundles up and blasts you into pieces. I mean, where the hell did that come from? Anyway, I guess it was nice.